Hi everybody, my name is Bill Wilkin. Thanks so much for coming in tonight for our continuing series on the American Revolution from a military history perspective. And tonight we'll be talking about one of the three great adventures of the American Revolution. We've got, in my opinion, the three great adventures are the Benedict Arnold and his men invading Canada by way of Maine. We've talked about that. I'll be talking, we've talked about that, and it's a previous YouTube. George Rogers Clark and the Virginians out in the Illinois Territory. We'll talk about that later on in the semi-quincentennial. But tonight we'll be talking about Henry Knox and the brave guys who got cannons all the way to Boston and allowed George Washington to wave farewell to the British Army. So that's going to be our topic tonight. So come on in, Joe. Come on in. I'm just getting started on YouTube here. So here we go. I always believe that it's important that an audience know the credentials or lack thereof of the people they're listening to. So I've got the radical wallpaper and background. I still haven't figured out what I want to be when I grow up, but that's that. Also, this is sponsored by VA 250 and especially the Loudoun County Committee of VA 250. For information on our activities in Loudoun County, loudonva250.org. Recommend it highly. Not to be confused with other national organizations that are wrestling and driving cars and doing other exciting things. All right, declaration. I am not an AI-generated image. This is not an AI-generated voice. The words you're about to hear were not scripted by AI, and the major research was not done using AI. How did I do it? I read a couple books. I recommend, well, there's not a whole lot about full-length book treatments of Henry Knox and the Noble Train of Artillery, but William Hazelgrove has his book out in 2020, and of course, anything related to New England, Nathaniel Philbrick is the man. So you got to recommend those. Also, the overview of our 1776 journey together. You cannot do better than David McCulloch's book, appropriately named 1776, and the first volume of Rick Atkinson's trilogy, The British Are Coming, which goes all the way up to Trenton and Princeton, what we'll be talking about at the end of this year. But Rick Atkinson, combat correspondent, very cool guy. So the title makes you think it's just about Paul Revere. It's not. It's the whole swoop. All right. Good. So how are we going to go about this? First of all, we'll mention Washington's problem in Boston. Number two, the story of taking Ticonderoga. Number three, Henry Knox, our key person in this story. And Act 4, Dorchester Heights and checkmate for the Royal Navy. So what's Washington's problem? Washington has inherited a militia army that is surrounding the core city of Boston. And you'll see Boston is basically an island with a little piece of spaghetti that's getting it to the mainland. The good news for Washington is he's got them surrounded. The bad news is how do you attack that? How do you attack that with amateur soldiers? Now, the British problem is the flip side of that. They're in the middle, and they're reasonably safe from direct assault by the Americans, but can they come out and fight? The last time they tried that was, see the northern area up there where it says Charlestown? That's where Bunker Hill is. Last time they came out to play, they lost horribly, casualty-wise. They got the ground, but they lost an awful lot of casualties. As we learned in our first talk together, golly, was that last fall? 90% of the British officers who got killed in action in the American Revolution were gunned down at the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's how serious it was. So now we've got a bit of a stalemate here, as I refer to it as a standoff. Washington can't go in and get them. The Brits can't break out, and they're all just wondering, what are we going to do? And the clock is running. Washington and his army is about about to go home on December 31st. That's going to be a recurring problem for Washington, isn't it? When we get to, this is in 75, he's going to have that same problem as 76 dawns, or as 77 dawns outside of Trenton. So what's going to break this whole thing? The guns of Fort Ticonderoga. Word gets back, some of these men had fought in the French and Indian War. They knew that Fort Ticonderoga was a major French fortress. It didn't look this good during the American Revolution, but it's a serious place with a serious amount of artillery available. And you combine that with the other British base down the lake, which means north toward Canada, Crown Point, and you have a warehouse of artillery. The problem is, it's what, about 350 miles from Boston. So the first step is for the Americans to take control of Fort Ticonderoga from the tiny little British garrison that's there. And that, of course, is the story of May 10th, 1775. Ethan Allen and a bunch of hooligan cool guys from Vermont called the Green Mountain Boys, and Benedict Arnold and a pickup team from Connecticut and anybody else he can get his hands on. Long story short, they've got Ticonderoga. So what's going to gradually move us through the story, May 10th, as we said, Allen and Arnold took Fort Ticonderoga. By November, George Washington is in command, and he tells Knox, go get them. So in November 16th of 1775, Knox is starting out on the epic adventure of his life. By December the 5th, Knox arrived at Ticonderoga, and of the more than 150 guns available, he finds 59 that are not so badly rusted or worn out. If we've got any gunners, artillerymen, naval gunnery officers in the crowd, you know that a gun tube wears out. It has a lifespan. You can't just keep on firing, or else you're going to end up with a fragmentation grenade that's bigger than anything you want to see go off. So he has to do some very clever work selecting his 59 favorite cannons. Spoiler alert, it's going to work. He's going to get to Cambridge on January the 24th. The adventure is between December the 5th and January 24th. I recommend highly going to visit Fort Ticonderoga, by the way. It's in private hands. They've got a private foundation like Colonial Williamsburg and Mount Vernon and other key places. Marvelous place. Say hi to Matt Keegle. He's the lead curator there, heck of a nice guy. Fort Ticonderoga also has great conferences. I'll be up there in October for one on the Battle of Valcour Island. So if you ever see anything offered from Fort Ticonderoga, great bunch of people to be with. Just grab an Airbnb quickly. For some reason, the French, the Brits, and the Americans, nobody's built hotels around the area. All right, so who's our hero of the story? This is Henry Knox. This is, I was telling Terry, I always try to give the artist some credit. Charles Willson Peale painted this during the Valley Forge winter in 1778. So this is what Henry Knox looks like the following year, basically. We're just going ahead a year, 2 years. So this is a miniature. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan in New York City. Knox is not one of these prosperous big shots that the Marxist historians would have us believe all the revolutionaries were. He was at a great school called Boston Latin until he was 9 years old. His dad went away to the Caribbean and never came back. Therefore, he had to be apprenticed. He was hired by a local bookstore. He eventually worked his way up the American dream and owned his own bookstore called the London Bookshop. Remember, this is before independence. He read extensively and he learned a great deal. Now, in some of the films that you might see, there's one about Washington's Crossing in which they recklessly have George Washington make disparaging comments about Henry Knox, you know, set your fat you-know-what down or you're going to sink the boat or something like that. Henry Knox was a big guy. He wasn't a flabby guy, if you know what I mean. There are people who are 6'3" and can carry 250 pounds very nicely, and I want them on my side when the fight starts. So he does have physical strength. There's a story they tell about him that one time he was walking down the street with some friends and a wheel had fallen off one of the carts in downtown Boston. And Knox actually was able to hold the cart up while they put the wheel back on the axle. I mean, that's pretty cool. He's a cool guy. We underestimate Henry Knox. He had had a firearms accident that blew off a couple of the fingers of his left hand. So the rest of his life, he had a scarf, or any scarf that kerchief he could get his hands on, he'd wrap it around his hand to disguise the disfigurement of his left hand. When I was younger, I had the honor of meeting Senator Robert Dole, and of course he had been shot up very badly in the Italy campaign in World War II with the 10th Mountain Division, and he always went around with his shot up right arm with a ballpoint pen or something so that people would understand that he's not going to try to shake hands with an arm that was wounded for our country. But the cool love story of Henry Knox, I'm a bachelor, I'm allowed to like love stories occasionally. He married a girl named Lucy, and her family was big-time Tory, big-time loyalist. So Henry had to court Lucy secretly for almost 2 years. She would go by the bookshop and do this let's flirt at Barnes and Noble kind of a thing. And they actually had to elope with the help of Henry Knox's brother William. So anyway, cool story. All right, now Henry Knox gets himself to the Champlain Valley, this incredible geologic karate chop that goes right down through from the Canadian border all the way down to the Hudson and all the way down to the Atlantic. And he selects his pieces, and then using land routes and a little creek basically called the Lachute River, see where there's 2 stars in the middle? Ticonderoga is the star, the left-hand red star, all right? So we've got the town of Ticonderoga is over there. That's good if you're driving and getting your Airbnb. But Fort Ticonderoga is actually right on the water. And there's a little stream of water with rapids and stuff and waterfalls that links Lake George flowing through the Lachute and then flowing north all the way eventually to the St. Lawrence River. So it's a cool place. What happens is that Knox has to get the guns, some of them off the walls of Ticonderoga with pulleys and ropes down to the guys. Some of them are taken by boat on the Lachute River. Others are taken by carts and dragged around to get to Lake George. He gets to Lake George, he's got 45 boats, anything you can get your hands on, and he's got to get to Fort George, which is at the bottom of Lake George. So he's got to do that, and he's got 60 tons of dead metal that he's hauling. And on top of that, George Washington said, carry as many barrels of flints and bars of lead as you possibly can. Okay, George, okay, make life easy here, huh? All right, so that's going through. He sends a famous letter to George Washington on December the 17th, and he gives him all the details and stuff. This is the 120,000 pounds. And he optimistically tells General Washington, I hope in 16 or 17 days, a noble train of artillery, and that becomes the nickname for this whole expedition. If you're reading through the brass, a cohorn is a miniature mortar. It's only about 150 to 300 pounds. It's almost like if you're studying World War I trench mortars, it's just meant to get something over the top into the other guy's fortifications or field fortifications. You'll notice that the different cannons, he's got brass, and he's also got some of the iron. The ones that Washington really needs are the 18-pounders. If you have an 18-pounder, heck, it only weighs 2,800 pounds, but that's what's going to ruin the British Navy's day. There's about 4 or 5 of these weapons that are going to be the game changers. The others are more field guns. You have some of the others that are small. 6-pounder is respectable. They've got 8 3-pounders. You're going to see a lot of 3-pounders as field artillery during the war. So this is what he's doing. And this is actually the letter itself. It's in the Gilder Lehrman collection in New York City. Don't try to read it unless you've got, tremendous, tremendous vision. All right. Now, the thing is that Knox is coming from the Boston area. He's got to find a way to hire, he thinks, 80 teams of oxen and 45 heavy-duty sleds. But he doesn't have any connections. There's no Home Depot. You can't just go down or something like that. So he tries to find contractors, the farmers who have teams of oxen and teams of horses. Have you ever seen those great work horses? We have some up at Temple Hall Farm and the Clydesdales and stuff. We're talking serious draft animals here. But he tries to hire it, and he's out of town, and he needs somebody local to make things work. And Major General Philip Schuyler is one of 4 major generals appointed by the Continental Congress. He'd had some French and Indian war fighting, knew his way around Ticonderoga, which was a battlefield repeatedly in the French and Indian War. But he's an older gentleman now, okay? He's no kid. He's, prime of life. And he's also managing the invasion of Canada at this time. So the problem when you're in higher command, right? It's not like a TV show where you've just got one issue all the time. There's usually multiple stuff going on. But he's great at logistics and transport, and he's the guy who's going to put everything all together. Now, you may not know much about Philip Schuyler. You probably know about his daughters. And his daughter, Eliza, ends up getting married to an aide to George Washington named, you can sing it if you like, Alexander Hamilton. Okay, that wasn't bad. Okay, but she's a babe. Okay, no wonder Alexander Hamilton was crazy about her. I hear the other 2 girls weren't bad to look at either. This is the drawing room of the Schuyler Mansion in Albany. You can still go and visit it, and that's where they were married. So if you like that kind of thing. As you'll notice, Eliza survived poor Alexander Hamilton by a good number of years, and she's the one who told the story, as the song goes. All right, so how's the journey go? After they get down to Fort George, right up by near Glens Falls, they have to switch over from the boats to the sleds and maybe a wagon or 2. Now, on their way down through Lake George, it wasn't easy, all right? He had gondolas that were 55 feet long that can hold up to 3,000 pounds. He has bateaus that are 60 to 75 feet long. These are basically floating barges, basically, you imagine, flatboats. And what the Americans have a way of taking Spanish words and French words and making a whole new thing out of it. But we end up with 30 to 40-foot boats named piraguas. And so he's got those, and they're going down. The problem is that it's freezing. And he's got to get those boats all the way against the current, all the way south to Fort George. And the weather is in their faces. And if the Lake George freezes, what's going to happen to those boats? They're going to get locked in, and Washington won't have the artillery he needs and curtains. So imagine every morning when Henry Knox wakes up, and a quick little nap at the side of the lake with a bonfire going all night long, the ice is creeping out from the banks. You ever noticed how water freezes on a pond or a lake? And his channel is getting more and more narrow. The other problem in Lake George, if you look up Lake George on that brilliant source, Wikipedia, there are 170 islands in Lake George, even though it's more than 170 feet deep in places. So we end up with, is this a dangerous place to be running? And then you're cramping the ability of the boat teams to go around those islands because you've got ice. And in fact, the ice is going to go to the islands faster than it is anyplace else. So these guys are working hard, and this is the easy part. All right. One night, December 9th, they build a big fire on the shore, and they're surrounded by Algonquian Indians, Native Americans, and they think this is curtains. And it's no, they just wondered what a bunch of crazy white people would be doing out in the middle of winter, standing around a fire. And the Algonquians invite them back to their village and give them shelter for the night and send them on their way. So, way to go, Algonquins. There's a place on the lake called Sabbath Point. As they're going on the lake, one of the scows runs aground, and it has a 5,000-pound cannon on it. They need to use pulleys and ropes. They have to send back to Fort Ticonderoga for more help. Knox is way out in the lead trying to scout things out. His brother William, remember from the elopement, his brother William has the rear guard, making sure that no cannon left behind, all right? And so William is the one that's got to get this scow off the rocks, get it to shore, check the boat out, repair it if necessary, and catch up with the rest of the team. And bless his heart, he does it. William lived from 1756 to 1795. On the 14th, William gets the grounded scow ashore, he shifts the load and carries on. They have to start cutting the channel because the ice has now gotten so close to the middle. Was Henry Knox racing against the clock? You know, but the lake was now frozen. They're rowing into the wind. At Fort George, there's logistic confusion. Knox is waiting from the sleds. His contractor, remember we said Philip Schuyler is great help, sends his letter. And the problem is that things are still not, the sleds and the oxen and draft horses are not at Fort George. So an amazing Hollywood moment, December the 24th, 1775, through December 27th, Knox goes by himself, or maybe one or two other guys, through a blizzard to go to Albany and talk to Philip Schuyler and say, General, the stuff's not there. I need this gear to load up and get this. So he has a conference with Schuyler, remember the living room I just showed you, and he ends up going through snow 3 feet deep. That's really, really cool. Now, once they get to Fort George, it's 9 miles to Glens Falls. You see Glens Falls on the eastern side of the river up there. Then he has 22 miles down to Saratoga, then 16 miles down to Half Moon, where the Mohawk River comes in and meets the Hudson. And then they have to cross the Mohawk River, then 7 miles to Albany, and then they have to cross over the Hudson to get to Kinderhook. And once they're in Kinderhook, they're ready for the next phase, which is getting across the Berkshires. Are you reasonably impressed with these guys so far? All right. Once they get to Springfield, they feel like this is spring break. This is just wonderful. And they'll get to Worcester, which is where Knox's wife Lucy is waiting, and then to, Framingham, and where they hide the guns, and Knox gallops ahead and tells General Washington, sorry I'm late. All right. The first crossing of the Hudson, the heaviest sled went first. Why would you send this heaviest sled first? Because if they can make it, everybody else is going to make it. He spreads them out. They had drilled holes in the ice the night before to thicken the ice. Think about that. We drill holes in the ice. What's going to happen? The water is going to come up and glaze over the top of the current ice, and hopefully we can get to the magic number of 7 inches thick, which is what Henry Knox figures he needs to get the heavy guns across. All right. He's got his contractor, John Becker Sr., and this is so dangerous that they put the livestock, whether it's the draft horses or the oxen, whatever, and they put the lead chain out far away from the sled. And the ropes, there's distance, say the oxen are where the windows are, and I'm back here and I'm a cannon in the sled. If the cannon in the sled starts to break through the ice, why is John Becker walking along with an axe alongside that rope? He's got to cut the rope or we're going to lose those precious draft animals. We can fish the cannon out probably later on if we have to. Those animals are the success or failure of this mission. And that's what's happening. The ice broke, and they end up having another night in which they have to shelter in a pine forest. They unyoked the animals, kept them together, and then Knox went ahead. All right. They also lost a cannon in the Mohawk River, because we know there's arguments that go on when, every time you guys who've done military history, there's always some grad student that says, no, they wore sneakers or something. And the thing about this thing is how many cannons actually got to Cambridge. That's the cute little argument. There's another ludicrous argument about they were all oxen or they were all horses. It's like, no, the sources show that at different times, there's a predominance of oxen, other times it's a predominance of horses. They're going to change over to almost all oxen to get them through the mud from Springfield on, because that's the flat country. Anyway, one of the arguments is how many cannons got to Cambridge. And the decisive evidence, according to Matt Kegel and his team at Fort Ticonderoga, John Adams was visiting the camps in Cambridge in the spring of 1776, and he was a meticulous record keeper. He did an inventory. Remember the inventory I showed you that went out with the letter to George Washington? By the time John Adams is doing his inventory, Adams finds only 58 guns, so that verifies that there's one in the Mohawk River still. Anyway, they get that. At Albany, it really got dangerous because they're crossing the Hudson. They've made 4 different crossings by the time they get to south of Albany. And while they're there, the biggest cannon is going across the Hudson. It not only breaks through the ice, but it creates a 14-foot wide hole. Now, they managed to cut the ropes and save the draft animals, but they've got their biggest cannon in the Hudson River. And one of the great miracles of the trip is the citizens of Albany hear that Knox is in trouble. And they come out by the hundreds and pitch in to get that cannon out of the river. And it's called, I would call it the miracle of Albany. Knox is so impressed that he nicknames the gun the Albany. And they carry on. So, all right. By the time they get to Kinderhook, they press on. One of the sleds breaks. They have to stop for 2 days to fix it. By this time, they're nearing Westfield, and there's not enough snow, and that's a problem. So they don't have enough snow. They have to work 4 teams to pull one sled, and then they unhitch the animals and go back, get another one. So this is the up and down that they're dealing once they're going into the Berkshires. January 11th, they get some snow, and then they reach a part of the Berkshires called the Devil's Staircase. You think this is going to be easy? They're going to actually be lowering the guns down cliffs. All right, this is the story of the Devil's. And then they finally get to a town called Blandford, which is not on this particular map. On January 13th, they're crossing bare ground, but once they get to Westfield, it cheers them up because the people all turn out and treat them like they're a parade of heroes. And they get good chow, and they get a good place to spend the night. And Henry Knox is so impressed that he takes one of those mortars and he fires off a salute shot for the people of Westfield. And they had never heard anything like that. And being the brat that he was, I think he did it 2 or 3 times, you know, just to impress everybody. They had fun. Of course, he also did that to Worcester to show off to Mrs. Knox. Then they have, when they're there at Westfield, they've still got 91 miles to go. Takes them 2 days to get to Springfield through the mud. The New Yorkers by then had completed their contract, the Teamsters, the draftsmen, the farmers, the contractors, whatever you want to call them. They're ready to go home to mama. They're done. They've done what they promised to do. And so now Knox has to recruit other farmers, contractors, transport people to get the final third of the journey. And one of the guys that comes to his aid is a man named Solomon Brown, who is one of the militia leaders at Springfield, and he puts together the team of men and animals to get them through. Fortunately, the ground froze. They crossed Worcester Pond and Lake Quinsigamond, forgive me, Massachusetts people. And so by January 20th, he's at Worcester, says hi to his wife Lucy, another mortar salute, and by the 24th, they're at Framingham, 15 miles from Cambridge, when he gallops and goes forward and reports to General Washington, "I'm here." You think General Washington feels pretty good when he gets this? Now, Henry Knox had been real good sending reports. Washington loves reports. And so he's doing that. He's also writing very charming letters to his wife, Lucy. Lucy and Martha Washington become great friends. They spent the winter at Valley Forge together, the winter at Morristown together, and on the way to Yorktown, Mrs. Knox stops off in Mount Vernon again to see her friend Martha Washington. So, ladies, solidarity, networking, it's all there. All right, so it's an amazing accomplishment. 59 selected, 58 arrived, 350 miles in 50 days, 4 river crossings, 1 cannon lost in the Mohawk. Remember the story, the Albany. They crossed the Berkshire Mountains, and he reports to General Washington. This is one of the more famous bits of artwork that we have from on this subject, done in 1946 by Tom Lovell, 1909 to 97. I believe this was commissioned for the Dixon Ticonderoga Company. Anybody remember what a Dixon Ticonderoga was? I guess they're the most high quality pencil you could get in America. When I Googled to find out where the painting is now, I caught an announcement of an auction in which it was purchased by someone for $109,000. So if you figure out where this painting is, let me know and I'll give provenance as to where it is. But whether the guys were in fancy uniforms very much, I don't know. They sure weren't going up high ground. That's Fort Ticonderoga in the background. This is not the terrain around Fort Ticonderoga, but it does provide a little bit of a historical notch. Knox and his men traveled in divisions. They weren't all piled up like this. So you would see 1 or 2 guys. There was about a platoon of Continentals that was their security team. But it gives you the idea. These guys have had a very, very tough time. Notice how the carriages are disassembled. They didn't take them with the wheels and the trail on. They took the barrels and then loaded up the wooden parts for reassembly once they got to Framingham. Who are they up against? They get to Boston. This is the British commander, Major General William Howe. He's got very distinguished family, son of a Viscount. His mom was a lady of the bedchamber to George III's mother. Eton, a very nice school over there. And he fought in the War of the Austrian Succession in Flanders. And he was one of the guys who went up the cliff face in Quebec that allowed Wolfe to get up on the Plains of Abraham in 1759 and defeat Montcalm and basically grab Canada for the British. So this is a serious guy. He also survived Bunker Hill. He went up with the men on the left-hand side of the attack, and so he knows what it's like if you go up against Americans who are behind logs and earthworks. He's appointed to succeed General Gage, and so he's in complete command after October 11th, 1775. The highest praise you can imagine. What does George Washington say about Howe? the most formidable enemy America has. So Washington can't get it out of his head that he needs to wait for the Back Bay to freeze and just, hey diddle diddle, right up the middle and just go right across the frozen Back Bay and attack Boston and fight street by street and get a decisive victory. Fortunately, he has a council of war. Continental Congress has told him you must always have a council of war. This, our democratic impulse. And the other officers say, please, General, we don't have enough ammunition. We don't know what fortifications they've got on their streets. And they talk him out of it. Fortunately, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Putnam proposed the idea of let's get up on Dorchester Heights, 100 feet above sea level, and if we can position these new guns that Colonel Knox has brought to us, we can ruin their day. And so that idea goes forward, and March 2nd and 3rd, while the movement and supplies and the cannons are brought in from their hiding places in Framingham, the British are distracted by cannon fire from other directions in the harbor, and on March 4th, they spring their surprise. This is the spoiler alert. This is what is going to happen. They're going to put up temporary fortifications. This framework is called a chandelier, and the bundles of sticks are called fascines. And when you can't dig down into 2 feet of frozen earth, you have to build your own fortifications. And that's what they did by working hard all night long. And the guy who came up with the idea is Rufus Putnam. Now he doesn't have a household name, but this guy's cool. Massachusetts childhood, another one of these self-taught guys working himself up, teenager in the French and Indian War, millwright, farmer, and surveyor. Is that a winning hand if you're talking about dragging these guns up Dorchester Heights, finding the right place to put temporary field fortification? Now, he's got it. This guy's got the skill set. We may not have the best starting players all the time in our history, but by God, we've got an excellent bench. His cousin was Israel Putnam. Before the war, they actually did surveying in Pensacola. A shout out to our Florida people on YouTube. Also went over into the Mississippi Valley. So this guy got around. We underestimate how cosmopolitan some of these people were. He's lieutenant colonel, and he gets a book. The book that he gets is called The Attack and Defense of Fortified Places by Johann Müller. Müller takes his name to Muller, calls his first name John, and got a job at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, which is top flight in the British military world for engineers, artillerymen, the smart guys. All due respect to Sandhurst. But Woolwich is really a cool bunch. And I actually got the facsimiles of it, and sure enough, here it is, chandeliers. And they're talking about filling them with fascines. So that's the page that Putnam read that gave him the idea that won the battle. Now, I've been joked that I can't give a talk on the Revolutionary War without one painting by John Trumbull. Guess who the guy is with the arrow? That's Rufus Putnam. And he's right behind our Virginia hero, Daniel Morgan. All right? So this is later on. Rufus Putnam will have a brigade-sized unit at the Battle of Saratoga. And on the big painting, you can see where he is behind. Just find Daniel Morgan, and you've got him. So this is our guy, Rufus Putnam. Let's see what else we got on him. He later on went on to design Fort Putnam at West Point, and he became a brigadier general in Ohio. So a shout out to my friends in Marietta, Ohio. He led the veterans in their land claims out in Ohio, and so he was a very, very happy guy later on. The miniature of him was done by John Trumbull at New York City, and it's now in the collection at Yale. All right, so what's this nighttime operation he's recommending? He says, guys, we got to get 200 wagons and carts, start after dark, and we'll load up those prefab fortifications, the chandeliers and the gabions. I'm saying that the American way instead of the French way. Hay bales, they stacked hay bales along the British side, British view of the trails, so that if you're a British officer in Boston looking across at Dorchester Heights, you're not seeing these wagons and men going up, zigzagging up Dorchester Heights. It also can absorb a lot of noise. There's a screening force down there at the bottom of the hill, just in case the Brits find out and try to attack. So they got to be cautious. They don't know how. There are spies everywhere. The work party of 1200, Brigadier General John Thomas, later on died up in Canada of smallpox. Some of these guys early in the war would have been wonderful people and leaders of our country if only they'd survived the war. But the draft horses dragged them up. 3,000 fresh troops replaced the work party to man the guns and prepare for the British counterattack. That was the mistake they made at Bunker Hill. The guys fought the battle who had dug the fortifications. Fresh troops, guys, always fresh troops. And shocked when Howe woke up, he said, let's attack. We can't let them stay there. And as his men, he doesn't just sail away without a fight. He gets his guys onto the transport ships and then onto the small boats, and a very windy sleet storm comes up and prevents Howe from launching the attack on Dorchester Heights. And it's that time when Howe decides that it's time to evacuate. So evacuation day, March 17th, 1776, still celebrated in Boston. Howe started out with 78 ships. He called out for help. Later, they used a total of 120. He's got 9,000 soldiers, 1,200 dependents, and about 1,000 loyalists who would be judged as, I guess, traitors by the Patriots going in. The fleet paused at the entrance, get some water. They destroyed Castle William in the harbor. And because of the smallpox going around, George Washington said, I only want men going into Boston who've already had their smallpox, survived. And so he sends that group in, and he doesn't go in until later. All right. Now, if you want to learn more about the smallpox epidemic that went on during the American Revolution, I cannot speak highly enough of Elizabeth Fenn's books, Pax Americana. Half the book is about the white folks in the American Revolution. The other half is about what smallpox did to the indigenous peoples out west. Professor Fenn is an expert on the Hidatsa people out west, if you know your Lewis and Clark story. But it's a tremendous book. It's already circulating. Variolation was known, but it got you sick. You know, you got a mild case of the smallpox. Washington couldn't say, okay, boys, everybody get variolation, because his army would be laid up for 2 weeks and the Brits would just grab them all. So he chose to quarantine his cases, but Professor Fenn estimates 287 people died of smallpox in Washington's army. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we had somebody we trusted to tell us what it looked like in Boston after the British left? Oh, we've got Abigail Adams, one of the great letter writers of the American Revolution. Her dad was a Congregational minister. Her mom was a Quincy. Her cousin married John Hancock, had to practice her handwriting after that. She married John October 25th of 1764. Guess who presided at her wedding? Her dad. And her dad got in a little bit of a joke when the gospel reading for their marriage ceremony was Luke 7:33. And it's a comment Jesus is making about John the Baptist. And it goes like this: For John came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and ye say that he has a devil. So this is what his father-in-law is saying to him as he's about ready to marry his wonderful daughter. Abigail Adams and John got along reasonably well. They had 5 children in the first 10 years, and when the guns are going off at Bunker Hill, she's standing on a neighboring hill with her little boy, John Quincy Adams. So we have An interesting lady. And she wrote a letter to her husband about what Boston looked like after the evacuation. She hasn't been in yet, but she's been talking to reputable people, and of course she wants to know how their townhouse looks. And fortunately, it hadn't been trashed. So she writes, "We feel a temporary peace, and the poor fugitives are returning to their deserted habitations." This letter, though, is important for more than just the story of Boston. You may have heard part of this letter before. This is the famous Abigail Adams letter in which she reminds her husband, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." So this is a cool letter of Abigail Adams, and goes on. Of course, she went with John as the first American ambassador to London, 1784 to 88, and she was the First Lady of the United States from 1797 to 1801. So many of the founding fathers went bankrupt during the war. Washington was in deep red ink. Jefferson repeatedly was bankrupt. All these guys, Henry Knox, his family loses their house in the next generation. But Abigail Adams did such a good job holding things together for that family that they came through okay. They came through okay. Quite a lady. All right. So what happens after the Brits are gone? Well, of course, the Bostonians build a beautiful monument, 1899 to 1902 on Dorchester Heights. It's quite lovely. And meanwhile, back in 76, Washington says they're gonna hit New York next. So General Sullivan led the 1st Brigade out of Boston, the lead element, to New York City on March 29th. And that's where the next exciting story takes place in the American Revolution. Knox will be there. He'll be at Trenton. He'll be at Valley Forge. He'll be at Monmouth. He'll be at Yorktown. So Henry Knox is a heck of a guy. So I hope you agree with me that it's one of the great adventures in American military history, not to be underestimated. And let's just end it right there. Thank you, everybody.